In this video, I'll look at starting out the sunset in the city. We have a limited scope in our city, although we can clone buildings if we need. So what we need to do then is set up the darkness first. This may sound odd, as that with no lights in the scene it is dark, and we've seen in some test renders or test shading, with just the scene light showing, it's dark around. What I want to do though, is get the very low sun in of my sunset, and get the long, low shadows going first. And that'll let me light up this city with interior and exterior lights on the buildings. I've done a quick Google search for Sunset City, and I've got all manner of sunset reference showing up. For example, in this shot, we can see a blue sky with some sunset colors down towards the horizon, lots of twinkling lights in the buildings, and a lot of actually dark surfaces. On the faces of the buildings, we tend to lose some of the corners. It's important then that I make sure some of the corners stand out. We can see in the building on the right, for example, a little bit of the geometry of side versus front. In this image of Las Vegas, showing the Bellagio here, we can see an overall orange tone, lots of lights on, especially in the fountains in the foreground, and the corners are fairly distinct, as we can see here on the hotel on the left. However, this is not nearly sunset enough, and has an overall orange hue I want to steer away from. I'd like this to be a little bit darker of an image. With some reference in mind, and I strongly encourage you always to get a lot of reference going, we can start out with our sunset. I'll go into a top view and press Z to zoom extents, making sure that nothing is selected. On the command panel, I'll click on the Create tab and over to Lights, and down under Photometric are my standard lights. These are not true lights in that they are theatrical. They're meant to behave as we need them versus actually looking like a light bulb, like the photometric lights that are in the bus stops, for example. I'll start out with, let's say, a Target Direct. Really, the difference between these, Target and Free, of the 4 different ones we can see here, is that the target light is made by clicking and dragging from where the light is to where it's aiming. I'll make a target light aiming across the city, not at a 45, to make sure that adjacent corners don't have the same lighting. I'll press F for front view, W for move, and pull this light up in the sky. Now what we're seeing here is this is a directional light, which means the light is essentially parallel, forming a large cylinder, or box if we need, with all the rays running the same direction, producing parallel shadows. I'll go over to the modifier panel. What we can see here is whatever the last light I had created, those parameters are on this light. In this case, it's at the default. An intensity and multiplier of 1, ray trace shadows are off, and it thinks it's a targeted directional light. I'll start out then by turning on my shadows, making sure that my shadow type is ray traced. What this will give me are crisp shadows that evenly show the geometry and shadow off all the fine detail I have, ray tracing through things like the metal screens on the first building. Then I'll play with the multiplier. I'm going to try it at maybe 0.8, and I'll see how this looks, and I'll also click on the color swatch next to multiplier. With lights, especially theatrical or standard lighting, it's perfectly fine to have dim, dark gray lights if that's what gets the job done. You may also have very bright, near black lights, or moderately bright, close to white lights. If it looks right, it's right. I'm going to add a little more saturation in this, bringing up the orange just a bit. I usually work with the hue, saturation, and value sliders first to get in the right range, and then if I need to fine-tune it with the RGBs, I can. But personally, I find that the RGB colors get very big very quick, and I'd rather have the subtlety here. I'm going to back off the value, pull up the saturation into actually a very dusty orange. Make sure the hue is maybe about mid-20s. Let's say 25, so it's got a good yellow to it. When I'm balancing the color of lights like this, I look at the slider, for example, on whiteness, and say, when this light saturates, what color is it? And there's a rich gold for my sunset. I'll click OK, and go into a perspective view. I need to get my rendering set up. What we can see here, pressing Z to zoom extents, is right now I'm using the default lights in my scene. Clicking on Realistic and choosing Lighting and Shadows, Illuminate with Scene Lights, may or may not give me the right look. So I do need to render this after all, to see how it's behaving. I'll go to the Render Setup, either by clicking on the Render Setup button or pressing F10. In the Render Setup, we can see that Mental Ray was on, and Final Gather is on by default. At some point I must have used it in this scene. For this rendering in this scene, I'm going to turn off Final Gather and light stylized in the way I want it, versus relying on Mental Ray to bounce light everywhere. With Final Gather off, all these factors gray out. I'll go over to the Common tab, and there's my HDTV 1280 by 720 video. I'll go to the renderer and just make sure that under sampling quality, it's set from 1 to 4, one sample at the minimum per pixel in the render, to 4, giving me decent anti-aliasing with a box blur. I'll press 8 as well, and this takes me to the Environment and Effects dialog. At some point in the scene, I must have either made a sky to play with or turned on the photographic exposure, and I'm going to leave it in here but push around the values a bit. What we're seeing then is a Mental Ray photographic exposure control, which gives us real-world camera controls such as shutter, ISO, and aperture to control how much light the camera sees and how long that lens is exposed or open. I'll start out then with a film speed of 100. This is a slow film for a night shot, allowing us a large range in how bright our lights are. My shutter is 1/6 of a second, and it should be a slow shot as it's night. There's just as much light in night shots as there is during the day. There's just less general light from the sky. Finally, I'll let my aperture be open, trying an f2 to begin with, so I am wide open with a shallow depth of field if I'm using depth, meaning that I'm letting a lot of light into the lens. Wikipedia has some terrific entries on shutter, aperture, and f-speed, and I highly recommend you read up on what these do. Now I'll try out my light. Notice that I've left the ambient light here as black. I don't want it to artificially raise the lowest level of my shadows. I want the black in my night shots. I'll zoom into my city and try a quick render, just to see what I get, pressing Render Production and letting it go. If you've played with bounce light before in Mental Ray, you can see this is considerably faster because we're not taking the time for Final Gather. We're not letting it bounce light in the scene. This is nice already. I've got long shadows here, as Mental Ray ray traces automatically. I've got inky blackness between the buildings, and a good bright spot of light here on the bus stop. This left side of Building 3 is almost completely black, disappearing except for maybe a little glimmer. And the windows, with their self-illumination maps, are starting to look lit, although I may need to push this around. It's also a quick render, and in this I want to make a particular difference. Sometimes we light using global illumination and Final Gather, allowing the rendering engine to bounce light. And sometimes we stylize the light to get the light where we want to tell the story we want. And in this case I'm choosing, yes, I want good materials with Mental Ray, but no, I don't want it to bounce light. I want to craft where the light goes, so I get areas of black where I want them. I like the way it looks, but I'll try one more thing. I'm going to bring up the multiplier on that directional light to 1.3 and just add a little more saturation in the color. Bringing that up a bit. And now I'll use my green to just back off the green a little bit, adding a little more magenta and warming and pinking up that sun color. I'll try one more render and see how it looks. What I'm after here is not a bright scene, but rather darkness in the shadows, differentiation between the corners, the ability for artificial lights like the bus stops to really have some light to them in contrast, and a general tone for the scene without adding too much bounce light. My inky sunset looks good. The sun is almost slipped below the horizon, and I've got black where I need it. Even seeing in the background here a building is lit in the windows. With my sunset in place, I'm ready to do any last tests and see if those shadows are in the right direction. If you need to move them around, just remember that your light should be diagonal in two views. In a top view, the light should be going diagonally across the scene, but not hitting objects at a 45. In a front view then, the same applies. The light is going diagonally down in the scene, but not at a 45-degree angle. This way adjacent surfaces get different lighting, and the corners stand out. In the next video, we'll look at adding in more artificial lights, really making these buildings come to life, and then fine-tuning the materials.